Hello.
Welcome to Rudolf Steiner's Philosophy of Freedom book study. Today we're going to be covering chapter 8, I believe the factors of life, and Jonathan has offered to lead the review for us, so I'll hand it over to you, Jonathan.
Okay. Well, I thought I'd try a presentation. It's a little bit old school because I'm using a blackboard.
Awesome.
So I titled it The Second Act because it's the second part of the book, and there's 3 parts to the book, so it seems like the classic 3 acts of a play. And the second act is titled The Practice, and then it kind of has a subtitle, The Reality, or The Reality of Freedom, as compared to the Theory of Freedom. And then this chapter, chapter 8, is in fact titled The Factors, or The Factors of Life. So I put practice, the reality, and the factors. I've highlighted factors. Why factors? What factors are these? How many factors are there? So my summary is, everybody's sort of summary or kind of capture or I can't think of an appropriate words right now, of a chapter will be individual. So I'm just going to go through mine. There's 12 slides here. So he starts by going into percepts and concepts, and the separate details of life are unified through thinking. All things, even ourselves and or itself, thinking, are determined by it. So that's the first part of the chapter. He enters us directly into thinking, that which unifies everything else, and the percepts whereby we receive things all broken apart. And then he immediately moves on to another factor. And he says, obviously, we're not just thinking beings, but we also are feeling beings. Feeling relates us, like thinking. Thinking has this relative capacity. Feeling also relates us to all things, but it doesn't relate all things to each other. So it's a relation between us and the things, not between the things themselves. As a sensation, a percept, feeling is direct and powerful. But like all sensations or percepts, it cannot find its own place in the world. So feeling can't sort of relate feeling to the world. Feeling can relate us to the world and the world to us, but it can't, feeling itself can't relate itself to the world. It needs thinking to do that. Another factor is willing. We're also willing beings. Now, willing's a kind of a standout factor because it's an objective factor. So it's out there in the world. It's not sort of internal like thinking and feeling, but it's objective. It really concerns the rest of the world and not just us, because it's our acts in the world, even be they, say, mental or emotional acts. But it too cannot find its way without thinking, else it is just blind act. if this explains that a little bit more, if taken as a world principle without thinking that determines it, not just in motive, so thinking can give our willing a motive, but also thinking has to determine what willing itself is in itself. So if taken as a world principle without the thinking that determines it, not just in motive as such, but primarily in itself, i.e. falsely on its own, then some kind of automatic causation is supposed. So we find a causation that it doesn't have a relation, it's just perceptual, automatic. We can't see how it is actually happening. It's fair enough to expect a real principle of existence, not just an ideal one, as feeling and willing might be taken to be real principles, but to set them up outside thinking is to oppose two intractable principles to each other. So if we say, okay, feeling is the ground of the world, which he notes maybe termed mysticism or something like that. If we take feeling as the factor which is determinative of the world, then we necessarily have thinking there too, because we're thinking about that and talking about it, but there's no relation between them. So there's thinking and feeling, and they're two intractable principles. And it's the same with will. We could put will as a principle in the world. Nevertheless, there is thinking there. And so the question is, how do they relate to each other? What is will to thinking? What is feeling to thinking? And there's no way that they can, will on its own can make that relation to thinking, or feeling on its own make that relation to thinking. Instead of those two intractable principles, we may find thinking as the world principle, and feeling and will both within it. And he finishes the chapter speaking about taking will alone. If will is taken alone as this kind of objective, real principle, it in fact becomes a metaphysical, realist thing in itself, affecting the world in a manner we cannot see. I mentioned that earlier. It's only thinking can do this relational job for us. So it becomes quite obvious as we work through the chapter that you can't have, if we need to go beyond our pure sensational percepts to find a world principle, it can't be just feeling. It can't be, and we need to go beyond the percepts because they're all separate, there's nothing to determine them. But if we're looking for a world principle, the factor or the factors of life, it can't be feeling on its own. It can't be will on its own. And even with will and thinking, or will and feeling and thinking, or feeling and thinking, there needs to be a unity within them, a relation. And it's only thinking that can do this relational job, as I put it. So he ends the chapter there. But then there's this wonderful thing, and in the 1918 edition, there's an addition to the chapter, and it's wonderful because he brings out something there explicitly, which is obviously implicitly in the chapter, but I guess what he found was that most people didn't have the ears to read it, as it were, and so he come 1918, he thought, okay, I'm going to say a bit more about this. It'll be a bit sort of put some more on the plate for my readers. The power of love in its spiritual form. So in this edition, and you can read what I summarize on the right in the typed text, what I wrote on the board. So if you find that difficult to read on the board, it's a bit more fleshed out on the right. So in thinking, in its
Jonathan,
essence, yes.
Sorry, your audio cut out, but it sounds good now.
Oh, okay. Oops. Okay. In thinking, in its essence, we find both feeling and will in the depths of their reality. So if we take will alone or feeling alone, they are less than their true reality. Only in percepts do we find separation. He says we must remember that only in percepts are things separated. So only that way is thinking, feeling, and willing separate things. But in thinking, in the core of the continuum of the universe, they are undivided. And I kind of amended that. So I called it in thinking the coring from the universal continuum. They are undivided. So trying to gather some sense of how expanding our idea of what thinking is beyond this kind of narrow sort of a view we generally have of it, to something that is coming from the core of the universe, as it were. And he uses these beautiful words: warm, luminous, and entering deeply into the phenomena of the world, brought about by a power flowing through the activity of thinking itself, the power of love in its spiritual form. And I thought it was maybe appropriate to end with a quote from Rumi, the Arabian poet. Your task is not to seek love, but to break down the barriers within that prevents love's flow. So, and this is the sense that I get from this work that we're studying, that it's not so much about finding something that we haven't got, but more kind of clearing away the obstructions, the kind of the veils that in front of our eyes, as it were, and our senses, our inner sense that have been obscuring that reality from us, of the power of love in its spiritual form. And then, in the PowerPoint, the triangle was supposed to fade in and like a little graphic. Our friend the triangle. I thought this seemed opposite, the singularity within us, raying out threefold, these three factors, triangular, particularized for us. And with that, it can kind of found on a fourfold base. You can imagine kind of the world, the sort of square of the world there. And this is the last slide, just repeating again. And that is it. So,
Thank you, Jonathan.
you're welcome.
I was thinking when I read that addendum, it was just sort of personally felt myself reaching for a name to, or just, the logos when, when Steiner was talking about thinking as, also including love and, or feeling and will and being love in its spiritual form. Yes, it was nice I appreciate your chalkboard writing. It was nice to see some actual handwriting. And one thing that I continue to try and understand after reading this chapter, and then sort of helped through with your presentation, is this notion of feeling, and I think, as I understood the way that he communicated it in the sentences on the page where he says this, feeling being the sort of reverse of will, as far as like the relationship of the subject or the self to the world. But anyway, I'll stop there. Just some thoughts. Matt, what are you thinking?
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks for leading us in this week. And I also, like Ashton, appreciate the handwriting, which I feel nicely captures the importance of personality in this chapter that Steiner's trying to get at, that would be lost with just this text that is the same for all of us. And getting to see your unique signature, as it were, I think conveys more of the message of this chapter than even what you explicitly said. So thank you for that. And a thought that I wanted to share was the difference between two kinds of love, and the difference made by thinking brought to the feeling and the willing that is related to this notion of love. Because it seems to me that what Steiner is saying is that love that's not permeated by thinking is kind of a subjective response. We don't really know why we're feeling it, and it's, in that sense, it's kind of biased. It's like we like some people, we don't like other people, just because of that initial percept that arises in our subjective experience. And when we bring thinking to that feeling, it's only then that we can love on purpose, that we can love as a free deed, as a real a free act. And so I think this is the distinction Steiner is trying to mark, that love permeated by thinking becomes a free deed, whereas love felt as a percept is not free, right? And so risk being biased or merely subjective. That seems to me to be an important distinction he's trying to make here. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Matt. Jeff, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking, where's the unmute button? Okay, there it is. I have a brief question for Jonathan and then a general comment. Jonathan, maybe I don't know if I misheard you, or were you saying like this chapter 8 is the beginning of part 2 of the book, but did you also say there are 3 parts to the book? Because I see 2 parts, chapters 1 to 7 and chapters 8 to 14.
Yes, there's or like say in this edition, oh sorry, I got my background. It's Final Questions, it's titled, The Consequences of Monism. So that in this edition, at least, there's the last chapter's made a 3rd part, as it were. So you have theory, practice, and then final questions.
Okay.
It seems quite fair.
Okay, no, that yeah, I think I've at one point gone through the edition you're talking about. So yeah, that would make sense, and that that kind of framework. Yeah, my general comment is I was also struck by the 1918 addendum. This idea of how all those lovely words he used to describe love, and it's luminescent and warm and all the rest of all that. But yeah, this relationship between thinking, feeling, and willing, the way he said it there, like he said it in so many words in different places, but here in particular, it really brought home for me the something that I relate to quite a lot, which is Wilhelm Reich's work. And what ran throughout Reich's whole career was this idea of what he called a common functioning principle. And so when Steiner described that triad that way, I saw it for the first time. That's his common functioning principle. Like the thinking is this primordial source of love, love, spirit love, and all that it is. And to translate it back to Reich's terms, it gives rise to this, what Reich would call an antithetical unity. Feeling and willing are these kind of opposites, but they're this kind of necessary polarity that manifests out of the primordial thinking. So the triangle kind of has that kind of relationship of, again, what Reich would call power, force, and energy. I'm intermingling the two of them, like, and mixing the vocabulary up back and forth. But anyways, that addendum in 1918 really hammered that home for me, something I never saw before, and in how Steiner is formulating all of that.
Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'd just like to pick up on Jeff's comments and Jonathan's comments, and then also in light of the text that we read. Jonathan, that phrase that Jonathan put before us, two, if not three different times, love in its spiritual form. That's certainly, to me, when I read this chapter, that it feels like it's kind of the very heart of this chapter. And I appreciated what Matt said, thinking of how, to begin with, like our emotional dispositions towards things are just sort of given to us together with anything else. And it's really only once we bring our thinking to bear on those sort of immediate emotional reactions that we have, that we discover the like the possibility for us to basically discover reasons to enlist our thinking to this in order to discover reasons to increase our feelings of love for many all different people, different beings, different phenomena in nature. And I guess for me, I really have this impression of kind of limitlessness about what is possible once we discover that ability, that thinking actually confers to us. I'll stop there, and maybe somebody would want to build off of that.
Hey.
Yeah, I'll build off of that. Because I have this feeling of this moral responsibility feeling, that to do this and to practice this takes a lot of commitment and practice, and always trying to renew this livingness of thinking in response to feeling, willing, percept. It's not easy. And like, if the idea that feeling is the ground of being kind of is easy, because feeling is automatic and feeling is juicy and I feel all the time, but if I leave that, if I follow that to its conclusion, what do I get but an island of myself that doesn't really relate to other people and puts myself first always. And it's an easy thing to do, but it doesn't lead me anywhere. And if I take willing as my ground of being, then there's this universal pulsating will that acts through me and acts through everyone else, and everyone should just be free to act how they want and do what they want. But that leaves you, you can be responsible in that way, but it leaves you lonely again. And it might be easy, but it leaves you lonely because there's nothing that unites all of those wills happening all the time. Whether it's an atom or an insect or a animal or other people or the divine will, it doesn't feel connected, does it? But it's easy to fall into that. It's kind of like, oh yeah, everything's just happening all the time. But taking the position that thinking has to be the ground of knowing, and it's difficult because it's like he says, when we reflect on thinking, it's kind of this place we don't really want to go. And when I reflect on, you know, experiences I've had of living thinking and try to re-illuminate that in myself, I often get stuck, and I often feel like I'm just kind of tired. And I've been watching Brian Gray's lectures on philosophy of freedom, and he uses this phrase, laziness. He says there are no limits to freedom but there are if we are lazy. And I thought that's because it adds that moral element. So I'll share that. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. I was reminded, hearing you speak, and Max, and as well the quote that Jonathan shared from Rumi about this moment, at least on page 116 in my book, where Steiner describes, where he says, the feeling must be the guarantee of the reality of one's own personality. Where Kubin talks about how we, in our time, or at least when he was writing From Normal to Healthy, there's like an epidemic of self-feeling, and there's like a grasping, or like a kind of longing for the self-experience that reflects, I guess, more of the active thinking, the awareness of the I, and that participation in thinking that potentially, connects us in this loving way with what we perceive, in a way that, as Steiner says on page 119, the will is a universal world process only insofar as it is ideally related to the rest of the world. So I was just thinking of that as you were sharing, and this responsibility that you conveyed, for, as I would put it, like bringing our will into continuity with the world. Matt, what are you thinking about?
Well, I was just really appreciating what Kate was sharing, particularly the way that this practice, it can be exhausting, but I feel like the effort to become conscious of our thinking, yeah, it's absolutely exhausting, but there's a point one can reach where, in contacting that intuitive activity and recognizing that we are that activity, there's a sort of overflowing energy that is discovered there. And so it's like, it's exhausting until we discovered that in some ways we're always already thinking, and the effort to become conscious of that thinking is as exhausting as any form of physical labor can be. And yet once we contact what we're always already doing and irradiate it with consciousness, it's effortless. That doesn't mean that engaging in a conscious thinking activity so as to permeate our feeling and our willing is just as effortless. I mean, that's an ongoing practice, because feeling and willing are, I mean, especially willing, right, is we're so unconscious of how that works. It's easy enough to raise my arm, but how did I actually do that? I mean, in terms of the muscles and the nerves and all of the stuff that goes into making that happen in a physiological sense, I have no idea how that works. And similarly with feelings arise in me. I don't really know where they come from. And so the effort, even once we've contacted and cultivated this intuitive thinking capacity, and it becomes a kind of second nature, there's still the effort to apply it to these other factors of life, right? And that's unending. Which is, I think, why we need to cultivate these capacities in community. We can help lift each other up, reflect our successes, offer frank criticism when we fail. So I'm grateful that we have each other to do this.
Amen. Angus, to share?
Thanks for that, Matt and Kate. Matt said almost exactly the words, or some of the words that I was going to say about the importance of community in this process. It's a beautiful process to be part of, and to be able to follow these questions together, to have the support. As most of you know, Jonathan, Jeff, and I, we meet on a regular basis and talk about these things, and it's a wonderful way of teasing out weaknesses in our own perspective. It's like strengthening our thinking, but also developing ideas, growing ideas together. And actually, one of the focuses, particularly acutely for me, the past couple of weeks, has been this bringing thinking to life. I've been watching quite a bit of Scott Hicks, if any of you know him, so he's quite interesting to listen to on that question, Scotty Hicks. And I've been doing lots of practices, and in actual fact, in the last video that we did, the very final part, we were reflecting on the fact that it's like throughout the structure of this book, Steiner he often gives these seemingly pointless lists of concepts that he runs through. But one of the things that occurred to me last week, it was now, was that there's actually something really a lot, from my perspective, of course, people are free to take it as they will, something far deeper going on, and it's quite simply connected to his first exercise. This exercise where it's like, grab a pen and just focus your thinking on that for 5 minutes and see where it takes you in your thinking. And I had a particularly strong experience, so I'm going to go, I'll try and communicate a little bit what happened to me when I did one of these little 5-minute exercises when I was out on a walk, taking the dog out for a walk on a beautiful sunny white day here. So I was focusing on a tree. All of my attention was on the tree. It's like calling to mind the different concepts that were present before me, that my thinking was recognized, all the things that I would not normally pay attention to, but I was trying to be Steiner-like, if you like, in that, okay, let's really nail a few concepts and see where the flow of the thinking takes me. And at one stage, I'm realizing, suddenly I start thinking of A.E., so the Irish poet, William Russell. He wrote a book called The Candle of Vision, which I read a long time ago. It's a really interesting book. It's definitely mystical in flavour. And he describes this ability to see past events, so like going back centuries as he walks through the Irish countryside. And this is like part of the journey of thinking that can happen when you start just focusing on concepts. They grow, or I experience them as growing in myself, and suddenly you're still connected to the tree. You know exactly how you got from the tree to William James Russell, I think is his name. You know exactly how you got there, but suddenly this tree becomes symbolic of something far, far greater. Anyway, I carry along on my walk, and about 10 minutes later, I'm actually at the scene of a double murder in our village. It's a strange village that I live in, but there was a double murder here about 10 years or so ago. And we have post boxes. It's like outside the houses here, because everybody lives in the countryside, so they can't go up to every door. Otherwise, the postman would only deliver about 2 letters a day. And I did my exercise again. So okay, I'm at a post box. It's a blue post box. I'm trying to I'm pulling out the concepts, see where it's leading me, and then I make this connection. So again, just through this journey of thinking of this postbox, it actually saw if it could have seen, it would have seen the murderers that went in. The murderers were caught in this particular case. So this very trivial postbox can become the source of this voyage of discovery through thinking, where you know the connections that are made. But it also can bring you into a different relationship to time. And now, and this is like my connection back to William Russell. This picture that he gives, that as we deepen ourselves into this process, we already begin to experience this expansion of ourselves as everything in thinking. This possibility becomes a direct, real experience. Instead of just seeing a tree as a tree as a tree, I see the tree as a multiplicity of concepts which can lead me out into different areas. But specifically on the dimension of time, I feel a strong link going on there. It's like just up to like the etheric aspect of the world. Anyway, why am I saying this? I think these exercises that I'm doing, and I'm sure various people in this group are also doing some type of exercises, and I do think there's great value in sharing what exercise we do, how we do them, and comparing notes. And something inside me is saying that we want to have a side group. We many videos ago, Jeff, Jonathan, and I, we looked at a book which is, as far as I know, still only available in German, Die Beobachtung des Denkens, observation of thinking. But we pulled a couple of exercises from that, and we just played with them to see what happened. Do you remember, guys? We did it. And I think this can also be, Kate talked about and Matt talked about this being possibly being a laborious exercise. It doesn't have to be, it's my own experience. If we do this right, it becomes, it requires work, but it also is a joyous experience. Truly, wow, life suddenly got so much bigger. So I thought I would, and there was a phrase that I was using with a friend in conversation last week. I use this phrase like a waking dream. Steiner talks about waking up from a dream. And I think that's one way that you can also begin to experience your thinking life once you begin to participate more actively in guiding your thinking, this is really a waking dream that you are beginning to create. You're waking up to something that is far bigger. It's there right in front of your eyes the whole time. If only you had the right exercises or tricks or something like that to engage with this world, which is ever present. Thought I'd share that.
Thanks, Angus. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for sharing your experiment. Because I'm so used to thinking about that exercise as like, closing your eyes and for just 5 minutes, like in my office or something or whatever. But I appreciated how in your example, in your walking meditation, and your observation of, the concepts that you bring to what you're perceiving, how in what you shared, a much more concrete aspects came out than I'm used to, I guess, thinking when I do it, even though sometimes the procedure of the pen coming into being, and all the materials of the earth that gone into that, but just the sort of also historical element that you mentioned with a poet coming to mind, or, this double murder, just as you were saying, carries that more, I guess, makes the etheric aspect maybe more explicit and less abstract. And I also, when Matt was sharing earlier about the sort of struggle to, work with the will and the feeling, I was thinking of, certain exercises where Like, for example, the meditating with the more radiant than the sun verse, how these sitting with these words of power can start to gradually, maybe without our even realizing it sometimes, inform our feeling and our willing. But those are just some thoughts. Max, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashton. Maybe just building off of what you said, and also trying to relate everything back to the heart of this chapter about thinking as love in a spiritual form. It occurred to me as Angus was giving his account, and I was trying to follow his account and trying to follow the coherence of his account. It occurred to me that it was only like there was a sort of a wholeness to it, but that was not something perceptible to me except through thinking, and it was through thinking that I was able to basically string together. Thinking provided a kind of through line that related what seemed to be completely disparate events that Angus was chronicling, and then it occurs to me it's the same kind of like if we just imagine there's 13 of us or 17 of us, there's 17 individual persons here, and then we might say we might just stop and say there's 17 individuals, but we all are also, we know that's not the whole story actually, and there is a oneness in which we are all 17 of us taking part. And as I start to think the way in which, as I think through this, I'm able to grasp the way in which it's thinking that basically like through can travel up and down this kind of hierarchy of being all the way to and so it's like once I grasp the pattern of thinking, basically revealing the coherence, like creating oneness out of many. Then I see it's in a certain way, like you can't get before thinking or behind thinking. There's something that makes this universe one and not many, and whatever that is, it's it's not before thinking or behind thinking or something. I'll stop there. I hope that was in some way intelligible.
It was. Thank you, Max. And just one thing I forgot to mention, Angus, this idea of another perhaps regular meeting, working with practices or talking about practices or talking about our experiences. I love that idea. I think that would be really cool. So maybe we can talk more about that. Daniel, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's clear. Thank you for this discussion. So I guess the image I was getting was this feeling that thinking is sort of this enzyme or this creation of on this edge of creating something new, and waking up will and feeling. I think people were referring to, I think you're talking about this island of loneliness, but that something about encountering another or having a relationship wakes up and gets will and feeling to stand up. And I'm aware of how important relationships are. Like they're so important that we can't let them go. At the same time, they're so important that we're scared of them too. Like we'd rather not. And that's where the exhaustion might come in. And so it's this volatile energy that we're drawn to and repelled by. And but that thinking is somehow making that, like the edge is calling on the centers of will and feeling. And there's some relationship between center and edge. And so I just have some questions about like how if we're in a universe of perpetual change, this quality of waking up from a dream, and you might want to call change as growth or a quantum change as different in kind than the change that's always happening. And I just have questions about that. And my other thought was, I heard the other day about in the Middle Ages, the Franciscans were about love, and the Dominicans were about knowing and intellect. And I've been hearing thinking as being both about knowing and about love. And I'm just wondering what we think about, are those the same thing? How are those different? So I don't know if that's a whole different topic, but these are the thoughts I've been having.
Thanks for sharing, Daniel. I was just part of what you shared just made me think about, I think the author's name, Matt Dieter Bruhl, is that the person who wrote a book on social threefolding? And he just talks about, you know, these polarities that we work with in community, and this kind of dance between the antisocial, I guess, and the asocial and the social. But just yeah, that this is a dance. Kate.
Thank you. I wanted to share some of my experiences with exercises in response to Angus. I sort of lost it because what Daniel was just saying was so good and gave me all these ideas, and now I have to come back to what I was going to say. I wrote a note. Oh, there are 3 things that I do quite often now to develop my thinking. The first one I made up by myself, but I think a few years ago when I was on a bus and I was looking out the window and there was, you know, bits of litter and random objects on the side of the road, and I was moving past them, and I reversed that and thought of them moving past me, and how objects come from somewhere, and staying with an object and tracing where it comes from, tracing where its parts came from, tracing, you know, and staying with it as much as possible. And it kind of grows into the past and also grows into the future. And it's something very difficult to hold on to, but it's sensation of this 4-dimensional aspect of everything. And I love to do it with just ordinary objects, thinking about where they've been and where I've moved them and where they would have come from before I had them. And yeah, especially when you're flying past something so quickly, it's a good exercise for me. So that's one of the things I do. Another one that I've done recently is kind of self-narrate what I'm doing, especially when I'm driving or working, and just sort of saying, and now I'm turning left, and now I'm turning right, and just sort of nothing matters except what I'm doing and my idea of what I'm doing. And then in that way, I feel thinking and willing kind of grow stronger together. And the important thing is to stay with the action as closely as possible. So often when I'm doing this, it becomes such a fun thing that I go, this is great. And I go, no, I'm not thinking about I'm thinking about what I'm doing. I'm not thinking about how this is interesting or how this is pointless. I'm thinking about what I'm doing. And I'm always constantly having to bring myself back, because it's my subjective self always has a comment to share. No, I'm not listening to that. I'm bringing myself back to just the action. And the final one I'm doing is because I'm learning anatomy at the moment, which I never cared about in high school, but intentionally bringing interest to cells, to these molecules moving around and these catalysts and enzymes and all the parts to this completely foreign thing that I've never seen and never will see, these diagrams of cells. And coming to it with I don't care and I don't know, and gradually learning more and more, and finally getting, oh, this is very interesting. And then once I get there, I go backwards and go, how did I get from disinterest to interest? And then I trace that. And through that way, I am more aware of thinking. So yeah, those are my experiences with the exercises. And if we did have I kind of made them up myself, but I think they're in the vein of Steiner's exercises and Kuhlman's exercises. And if we did a group about that, I would love that. It would be really helpful for me. So thanks, Angus, for inviting us to share.
Thanks for sharing. those exercises, your experience with those exercises, Kate. The last one reminded me of this somatic practitioner, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. She's really amazing. She's sort of healed herself in a very debilitating illness through the sort of pervading of her body with her thinking, or at least that was part of it, I think, which guided her healing process. And I think that's just it's so interesting because sometimes somatics is construed as if it's like the sort of mysticism of feeling or the metaphysical realism of the philosophy of the will. But I think it would be really great, especially for medicine, if there was this, as you were describing it, this more of a practice of bringing the thinking into a kind of participation of our perception of our body. Anyway, very interesting. Matt, what are you thinking?
Well, I appreciate what Kate's saying, the first part of what she was saying about sort of our spatial orientation, and then in relationship to objects, and then what Daniel was saying about different kinds of change and bringing up this image of the center and its edge, or the center and the periphery. And so to build on this, it seems to me that feeling and willing without conscious thinking activity are like being sort of awash in the midst of the periphery in an ever-changing world and not having any sense of orientation. And what thinking provides is, rather than just mere change, there's a kind of transformation and metanoia where we turn back to face the center again. But, in so doing, eventually in turning back to find the center, we find that the center moves with us, and eventually we see, oh, it's our own thinking activity. That's what's at the center. That's what provides us with the sense of orientation. And it seems to me that what is characteristic of the thinking activity that we're trying to realize is the way in which it is not located in space and time as we normally experience them. And I think several of you have been getting at this in different ways. And it's because we're taking the perspective on the whole from the center. And in this view, it's, in Steiner's view, it's thinking that connects us through the realm of ideas to one another, right? And we come to share this perspective from the center upon the realm of percepts, whether they be felt or willed. And so, just sort of playing with the center and periphery image that Daniel brought into the mix here to distinguish these two types of change, right? Change in position within the periphery in the world of process, and change as metanoia, turning back to the center from out of which our thinking springs, giving us a sense of orientation that's not limited to space and time in the way that feeling and willing are. So I wanted to throw that into the mix. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, Matt. I found that very helpful because it just sort of helps to, deepen the sense of the center as a kind of wellspring behind self-feeling or the self-percept. Not just getting stuck in the self-feeling. Jonathan.
Yes, I'd like to refer back to Daniel as well. And the point he was asking about the relation between thinking and loving. And I think it's sort of very clear really in all we're saying, especially say, for example, the examples Kate was giving, whereby she's looking at the rubbish outside the window and yet she invests this interest and attention in it. And that goes further. It takes her to the story of the rubbish, and imagine doing that not just to an inanimate thing. And why not? to invest love and attention to an inanimate thing, but to anything. And I think that's the direct how thinking is love, in that it's what brings us over the separation that we kind of, we feel out here at the periphery, as it were. And if the universe is sort of held in love, sort of necessarily to keep it all sustained and kind of nurtured and alive, like a mother loves their child and so forth, and a parent their son, or whatever. It's there's in being interested in something enough to think about it and to go beyond, like, thinking that's maths and just sort of I don't know, non-contradictory logic, or this kind of, these very useful sort of skeletal structures of thinking, but to take it into something that could itself go into an evolution. Even just like imagination is a form of thinking, just this sort of ordinary everyday imagination we have. And Kate was describing how she let her imagination go further, and Angus was describing how his imagination entered into further places. And so this ability of thinking to transcend space and time, as Matt was mentioning, shows us how we can overcome the sort of barriers and the separations that separate us. And I think that is love. I'm still sort of mostly sort of stuck in the sort of the desert of thinking, looking forward to the sort of fuller warmth, and that where I can recognize, thinking as love rather than love as love, feeling love just as a feeling, but also as a thinking thing. But it seems clear how that can be. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Jonathan. There's just a thought that I had on that last comment of, the connection of thinking with spirit. David, and then we'll wrap up with Jeff. I think I saw your hand, if you still want to share after David.
Hello. So I just got a few things. When I was in university doing my undergrad, and even now, if I get wrapped into a problem, I did nothing but think all the time, all day. I would think all day. And then I would go to sleep and I would be dreaming about what I was thinking about. Like I would see what I was thinking about all day. And then I would go for walks and I'd still be thinking about what I was studying and dreaming about. And then I go to the grocery store and I'd still be thinking about what I was thinking about. So the cashier talks to me, I'd be like, oh no, like, there's an external entity talking to me, like, oh. So I would be off put by that. I was always thinking. And in that state of mind, I really felt like I detached myself from the world, actually, though. I was like a separate island universe. And even if people were right beside me, they were like infinitely far away. And when I was like younger, I fell in love, as people say. And the feeling was pretty much like having no ill will towards anybody, feeling like anything that I was ever done is forgiven, like for everybody ever that I've ever met. And that feeling was paired with an immediacy of like, I would just drop all thought and be so involved in my percepts or my environment that I would just act immediately without thought. And I found that my actions were smoother and made more sense and were more intelligent. So that feeling of love was paired with this like dropping of all preconceptions, dropping of all thought processes that interjected between my interactions. So I kind of wonder how that fits in with thought in this more general sense of thinking about it. It's more like cosmic general sense of thinking about it. And also last thing is like all throughout human history, whether it's the scholastics or whatever, not to disparage them, I'm sure there's awesome things that they did as well, but like there's so many thoughts that humans have had that drag them into a certain way of thinking, and then they weren't looking anymore. They were just built up on their own systems. And they weren't looking, and then it took new thoughts, fresh thoughts to come up that were persecuted, like people were jailed for thinking the wrong thing or burnt at the stake as witches or whatever, or like whatever, Galileo I think was imprisoned, and other examples of the same kind. Like a new thought is usually resisted, and where's that new thought coming from? It's not coming from the old thinking. So what is that? And that's all the things I wanted to say. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, David. I appreciated in what you shared about, you know, that your experience of love and that connection with the living thinking. Just what I heard in what you described was freedom in multiple ways, especially like in a moral way, but as well in relation to thoughts, you know, not getting caught in a cage of abstractions. But Jeff, would you like to share before we wrap up?
I just for the sake of time, the groups and my own, I'll put my thought into volley.
All right. Well, we've got Jeff presenting on chapter 9 next week. What is chapter 9? Let's see.
The idea of freedom.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining and sharing, and see you all next week.